Today we're going to talk about voyaging and courageous voyaging, or how did the Hawaiians come to populate the Hawaiian Islands. Hawaii is one of the most isolated groups of islands in the entire world, 2,000 miles from anywhere, as we already know. We're one day on our voyage of 4 days out to sea. But before we leap into voyaging, we'll talk just a little bit about Hawaii, just a little bit about Hawaiiana, and we'll do just a couple of words of Hawaiian so that you'll all be able to speak a few words when you get there. How many have visited Hawaii before? Oh, quite the crowd. Okay, well, you guys can skip this lesson. Aloha, that's our meaning. That's our word that is a greeting. It represents hello, it also represents goodbye, and it also represents a spirit primarily of love. When we say we give you our aloha, that means we give you our love or our concern for you. Why? Because you're a member, as a Hawaiian or a visitor to Hawaii, of our ohana, or family. We'll talk about that in 2 days when we talk about Hawaii before Cook and the communal living of the Hawaiians and why the family was so very important to them. Mahalo. It's another word that all of you kama'ainas know, no doubt about it. That's the word for thank you, and you will hear that a lot in Hawaii. When someone renders a service, it would be appropriate to say mahalo. If we take a look at these words, we'll all see that they have a number of vowels in them, and the Hawaiian did not have a written alphabet or written language. That was written for them by the Western missionaries who came in early in the 19th century. So we don't have all the consonants in the Hawaiian alphabet. We do have all the vowels, but the vowels are not pronounced the same way. So we're going to talk about courageous voyaging, so we're going to ask you to be courageous in your pronunciation of Hawaiian and not be intimidated by all these vowels you see there. Just go a little slow and try to pronounce each one of the vowels in the word. For instance, in this last word that we just threw up, the I is not pronounced as an I in Hawaiian. It's pronounced as a long E or a double E. So this word would be hilo. Also, another vowel like U is not pronounced as U. It's pronounced as a double O. So it's more like moo or oo than you. So we can, everybody give this a quick try when we look at that. Let's throw up another word. How about this one? Well, what is that? Well, that's one of the reef fish around Hawaii. It's a triggerfish, but how would we pronounce that? Now, we're going to pronounce all the vowels, okay? So, 1, 2, 3, go. Huma, huma, nuka, nuka, apua. Excellent. Thank you very much. Onward and upward. Let's talk about voyaging now. You've had your Hawaiian lesson. Now we're going to give you a lesson in sociology, I guess. The Pacific Ocean. How large is it? It's a big ocean. Here, if we take a look, we're going to see the Hawaiian Islands right up here at the top, the upper right part of our chart. Down here, the lower right part, French Polynesia, Papeete, Tahiti. Down here at the bottom, New Zealand, the land of the long white cloud. Australia, the Philippines over here, China up off the chart over here, Japan, and of course we're way back over here yet. We're only about 400 or 500 miles off the coast of California, and it's 2,000 miles out to Hawaii. The Pacific Ocean is very large. Most people from the West, particularly Americans, didn't know very much about the Pacific Ocean, particularly at the start of World War II. The American government published a map at the start of World War II because we were going to send so many boys down there that showed a picture of the Pacific Ocean and superimposed upon it a picture of the 48 continental United States. And of course, the Pacific Ocean is so large it simply swallowed the continental United States. How big is it? Here's a zoom in of our part of the Pacific that we're going to be talking about. Hawaii is still at the top. Tahiti is still down here. If we were to measure the distance between American Samoa and Tahiti, it would be on a line that looks something like this, and that would be 1,400 statute miles. Well, how far really is 1,400 statute miles? For the Americans, that would be something like the distance between Los Angeles and Houston. For those of you from the EU, it would be the same distance from Paris to Istanbul, so it's quite a ways. From Papeete to Hawaii is 2,500 statute miles, or about 2,000 nautical miles. Now you may say that's a lot of distance between all these small islands out here in Oceania and Polynesia, and it is a long distance. And from the Western view, we say, wow, those little bitty islands, how small are they? If you took all the islands in Oceania and you put them together, they would represent the land mass of about half of New York State. So there's not a lot of land mass out there on that ocean. But you could say that ocean really separates these islands. From a Western viewpoint, you'd be correct, but from a Polynesian viewpoint, you would be exactly wrong. because the Polynesians do not view the ocean as separating them. The Polynesians, remember, are water people, and they're wonderful water people. The Polynesians view the ocean as that thing that connects their society. It's that thing that connects their urban areas, just as we view in the West those concrete ribbons that we drive on as a thing that connect our urban areas. The Polynesians view the ocean as that thing that connects their urban areas. What is Polynesia? Here's an excellent map of Polynesia from the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. The brown area, of course, is Polynesia. Starting at the top, the Hawaiian Islands, runs out to Easter Island off Chile, down through New Zealand, and noticing the boundaries here between Melanesia and Micronesia, it gets a little fuzzy in there, and there's a good reason for that, but that area would be called Polynesia. To the north over here in the blue area, we have Micronesia, the Mariana Islands, the Caroline Islands, the Marshall Islands, and so forth, and down below that, Melanesia, the green area. And Melanesia would be from the Celebes on down to New Guinea, out to the Solomons, and into Australia. Are they really different? Yes, they are really different. You find that the people in those societies have different cultures, they're different societies, and if you really were to check their DNA, you would find that the DNA was a little different also. The Melanesians probably came first. They were a darker-skinned people. They're the people that immigrated into Australia, and we know them today as the Australian Aborigines. The Polynesians came quite a bit later. How did they come? Well, this is our best guess at how they came. We don't really know. There was not a written record. The Polynesians were not a people of writing. They didn't leave any papyrus behind. They didn't leave much in the way of the archaeological record. But we think this is the way they came. The Melanesians came first out of Southeast Asia and off the mainland of China, moved down through New Guinea and down to the Solomons into Australia. The Micronesians next out into Micronesia, and then the Polynesians came through probably as the last wave of immigration. Why did they immigrate? We don't know. Nobody really knows. Why did anybody immigrate? Probably famine in the homeland, or a war in which they were the loser, or they were the people of a prince who was not going to be king and he decided to leave and go someplace else where he could be king. We can't really say, except that we know that they moved through Melanesia fairly rapidly. They probably moved through Melanesia from a historical viewpoint in 100 or 200 years, and on out in the islands where they really prospered and spread because they were water people. The Polynesian Triangle is where they wound up, starting over at Fiji and then on into the Marquesas, the Cooks, the land of the long white cloud, and on up into Hawaii. How did they get there? That's the question that everybody's asked for the last several hundred years, and for which we did not really have a good answer. Captain Cook asked that question when he arrived off Kauai in 1778. He said, "My goodness, look at these people." He pulled up to the island of Kauai. The Hawaiians came out in their canoes, offered them fish, fresh vegetables, fresh fruits and so forth. And he started talking with them, and he realized these people looked like the people of Tahiti. He had spent a lot of time in Tahiti. Their customs and mannerisms were like the people of Tahiti, and he could understand about 75% of what they were saying. Their language was very similar to Tahitians. But remember, he was 2,000 miles away, didn't know these islands were here, so how would these Hawaiians get here? He thought it was an amazing feat of something, he didn't know what, because he had sailed 2,000 miles in the most modern of King George's ships. He had the compass, he had charts, he had navigational instruments, and he couldn't figure out how these primitive people could move that far when he had two large ships and he had a hole to put his supplies in. He never came to a conclusion before he died there in the islands. After the Second World War, we had a New Zealander named Andrew Sharp that postulated a theory. He said the occupation of the Hawaiian Islands was just a fortuitous adventure. It really wasn't anything planned. It was people who were shipwrecked and just washed up on the beach, and that's the way it was. There was no reason to believe. There was nothing in the record that said these people planned a migration or anything like that. And that was the theory that took hold for many years after the Second World War and was preached around throughout Polynesia. The problem with that was that if you took a look at the trade winds and the currents, particularly here from Tahiti up to Hawaii, you knew that if you went out and you threw a coconut in the water off of Tahiti, it is not going to wash up on the beach in Hawaii. Why? Because in the southern hemisphere, we have southeast trade winds that are going to set it to the west. We have the south equatorial current. It's going to take it to the west. We do have a counter current, but then north of the equator, we pick up the northern equatorial current, which is going to set it to the west, and the northeast trade winds, which we're the beneficiary of right now, moving everything to the west. So that coconut may wash up on the beach in the Philippines or Taiwan or maybe even Japan, but it's pretty sure that it's not going to wash up on the beach in Hawaii. So how did those people get to Hawaii? And that postulated the question that a lot of archaeologists started working on after the Second World War and said, how can we prove one way or the other? And what they found was what they believed to be an early people called the Lapita people that had moved through the region early on. They were the predecessors to the Polynesians. And they found a number of shards of Lapita vessels or early clay jars and so forth in New Guinea and other places. And they noticed that the designs on these jars were very similar to the designs that would be repeated, or almost identical to the designs that would be repeated in Hawaiian and Tahitian tattoos and tapa cloth, the clothing that they wore. So the designs were the same, so it looked like there was a connection in the archaeological record back to the Lapita people, and they were connected there, and they moved out into the Pacific as a migration. And you could say the same thing to Hawaii, but how could we prove that? And the answer was, well, we'll see. The new theory said we had the Polynesians moving out from Samoa at about 120 BC to AD 300 into Marquesas, and then from Marquesas populating the Society Islands, the Cook Islands, and so forth, on out to down to Easter Island, down in the southeast, migrating down to New Zealand around 800 AD to 1000 AD, and they are the Maori people that we know in New Zealand now. And then we notice up here, the theory was there were two population migrations into Hawaii. First out of the Marquesas around 300 to 600 AD, and then the Tahitians came in the year 1000 to 1300. And that brings up an interesting story, because we know there were two migrations of two distinct different people into Hawaii. You may hear the story of the Menahunis when you reach Hawaii, and the Menahunis are called the little people. Now, there are no midgets in Hawaii, and there are no leprechauns in Hawaii. They did not mean people short in stature. What they meant was the Tahitian people who came in and took over Hawaii and pushed the Marquesans out were a much more cogent society. They were better led, they were better fed, they were more aggressive people than the Marquesas people, and so the Tahitians pushed them out, and so they kind of looked down on the Marquesas people as the little people. As a matter of fact, there were still some people in an early census up in Kauai, they got pushed all the way to Kauai and still lived up there, that said that they were from the original Marquesas people. So if you hear about Menahunis, what you're hearing about is the original Marquesas people and the original migration into Hawaii. Overlaid on this, on the dotted line, is Cook's voyage of 1778 to 1779. And we should take note, when the Tahitians came to Hawaii, what was the year? They started coming around the year 1000. What was going on in Europe around the year 1000? 1066 was a big year in British history. That was when William the Conqueror crossed the English Channel in the Battle of Hastings, and he took over England. Okay, at 1066, the Polynesians were already voyaging back and forth to the Hawaiian Islands. They were much more advanced in their ocean going. The Westerners would not get out here into the Pacific Ocean, being ocean-going people, for another 300 or 400 years. They were still coasting along the coast. It wasn't until people like Prince Henry the Navigator, who almost had to threaten his captains to use the compass and go offshore and discover the world. The Polynesians were already doing that. How do they do that? Well, if we say these people migrated from the west to the east, and we've already looked at where the trade winds and the currents go, they're in sailing canoes, right? And they're sailing against the wind. Doesn't that seem to be a bit odd? You can't sail into the wind in any kind of sailing vessel. You have to sail off the wind a bit, which means that you have to tack back and forth. Is this a bad strategy to be going against the wind? Actually not. If you're an ocean people, an ocean-going people, if you're an exploration people, and let's face it, they didn't just all load up in their canoes one day and move to Hawaii. Somebody went up there first, didn't they? And they came back and said, hey, there's all these islands up here, why don't we move up there? So that's the way that worked. Also, how did the sweet potato get to Polynesia? We tend to confuse the sweet potato with the yam, right? Everybody puts those on the Thanksgiving table and says, okay, we're having sweet potatoes or yams today. Two completely separate plant families. The yam came from Asia. The sweet potato is indigenous to South America. But at the time of coming to Hawaii, the Polynesians had sweet potatoes. How did the sweet potato get from South America into Polynesia? Somebody had to go over there and pick it up, didn't they? Well, the theory of sailing into the wind was really a very good theory for an explorationist. If you're going out exploring and you've got your friends together, you're going to man up your canoe, you tell the wife, I'll be back in 30 days, see ya, jump in the canoe, and off you go into the wind, and you're out there for, say, 3 weeks. You're running a little low on water, a little low on food, and you haven't seen any signs yet. What would signs be? Some flotsam and jetsam coming from upstream or upwind, some land birds. You haven't seen any signs of land to windward yet. Well, what would you do? Personally, I would turn around and go home because I told her I was going to have to be back in 30 days. So when you turn around, because you've been sailing into the wind, now what are you doing? You're sailing downwind. And zip, right back you come. So it's a pretty good strategy for explorationists. How do they do it? They had to have the canoe, right? You had to have an ocean-going vessel. It didn't have to be quite as big as this one, but you had to have an ocean-going vessel, and it was the canoe. The canoe was the thing. The canoe was the vital link. What did the canoe look like? We don't know. They didn't leave us any canoes, and they didn't leave us a written record. But what we do know, and in this great illustration by Herb Connie, was taken from some drawings done in the early 19th century by Westerners who came into the Polynesia area, and they drew sketches of what the Polynesian canoes looked like at the time. The voyaging canoes down in Tahiti looked like in canoes. And so the idea was brought forward that, okay, here's probably what they looked like. They were double-hulled canoes. What did that do for us? That gave us 2 hulls, which gave us stability in the ocean. It also made it catamaran-like, right? Because there are a lot of places in the Pacific around these atolls that are very shallow. So a catamaran is only going to draw 2 or 3 feet of water. And it's not going to draw 15 or 20 feet like these displacement ships are going to be, and they can skim right over these shallow areas. You would put a platform on top of your double-hull canoe to join it, and that's where you would live, and that's where you would store whatever it was you were transporting. You were transporting people, you were transporting animals, plants, and so forth. You could put a little shelter up there. That's where you put your supplies, and that's where you would put, say, anywhere from 12 to 24 people, depending on how large the canoe was, and you were ready to go to sea. The canoe was the thing. What did they put on it when they were going to migrate? Well, what would you take with you if you were going to a new land? Today, we just kind of take a couple of credit cards and maybe some cash. But that wasn't working for them back then. They were going to have to take whatever they really wanted to have when they got where they were going. So that would be, for mammals, dogs, pigs, and chickens. Remember, Hawaii had developed completely isolated. There were no mammals in Hawaii when the first people from the Marquesas came. There were birds and there were a lot of plants, but there were no mammals. So the Polynesians thought dogs, pigs, and chickens were fairly easy to raise, and they were also very tasty. So they brought along dogs, pigs, and chickens. They brought along over 20 different kinds of plants, and these plants are referred to in Hawaii as the canoe plants. They came with the Tahitians up from Polynesia, and they were the plants that the people were going to plant and raise because they knew that they could survive on them, and they're what they liked: banana, breadfruit, yams, coconut, sugar cane. They were going to eat all those plants. Then you had other plants that would be called working plants: bamboo, candlenut, pandanus, tea, mulberry, gourds. We'll talk a little bit about those in the next lecture and exactly what those plants, how they fit into society. How about on board? What they eat while they were out there? Well, the cuisine was probably not as good as this vessel, but it certainly worked for them. They had, of course, poi, that great Hawaiian starchy dish. How many people like poi? Come on, be honest. Not a hand went up, okay? Poi is kind of an acquired taste. It is a starch, but let's be honest. If you were to eat pasta without a sauce or a potato without any kind of dressing on it, it would be kind of bland too, wouldn't it? Well, so you have to have a little something to go with your poi. But poi is the taru root, pounded and mixed with water until it forms kind of a paste. Well, if you don't completely hydrate poi, you can store it for up to 30 days and it won't go bad. So you load up a bunch of poi, because that's what everybody likes eating, and some water, and you can make up fresh poi as you go along. Dried fish, coconut. We'll talk a lot about the coconut. The coconut was a wonderful plant for the Polynesians. Dried banana. Fresh fish. We'll be fishing over the side. We boat any tuna. My goodness, we're going to have fresh sashimi today. Yams and so forth. So they were able to put plenty of food on board to allow them to go back and forth between Hawaii and Polynesia, and back and forth that they did go. Who was the most important guy on board the canoe? It wasn't the captain. It was the navigator. Why? Remember, this was a Stone Age society. They had no metals at all. They didn't have a compass. They couldn't navigate by the compass. They didn't have any way to take star sightings or anything like that. They didn't have a chart that they were going to plot. So what they did have on board was a man known as the navigator, and he had spent his life learning to navigate. He had probably been taught at his father's and his grandfather's knee how to navigate in the open ocean without any of these Western instruments. And in Herb Connie's drawing here is very astute because it shows in the corner the stars. He's going to navigate by the stars at night. During the day, he's going to keep his eye out for certain shorebirds, look at the swell. He was the most important guy, and he was the guy that could get them where they're going without any navigational tools that we know today. How did he do it? He used celestial navigation. He memorized the stars. He knew the stars of the area that he was going to sail through, and this was a pretty good trick, because remember, the Tahitians were where? They're in the southern hemisphere, right? Can you see the North Star from down there? Ooh. No North Star. When you went north of the equator, you could pick up the North Star, but you were going to lose all the constellations that you were used to in the southern hemisphere. So they really had to know their stuff. Let's do a Polynesian navigation practice. If we know that the Big Island of Hawaii is about 20 degrees north latitude, how would we measure that if we were coming northbound from Tahiti? How would we know when we were at 20 degrees north latitude? Well, everybody try this. Let's take your left hand and make a fist and hold it straight out in front of you and put the bottom of your fist at the floor of the stage, just like that. If you do that, and then take the other fist, the right fist, and put it right on top of that one. Put the bottom on the stage and look over the top of the right fist. You can see what you're seeing out there is if you were early in the morning or late at night when you had a horizon, the bottom of your left fist would go on the horizon, the top of your right fist, you'd look over the top of it, and if you saw the North Star, guess what? You're at 20 degrees north latitude. You can give some Polynesian navigation a try on our journey out to Hawaii if you want to. Remember when we left Los Angeles, we were about 33 degrees north latitude, so the North Star would be fairly well above your right fist. As we get down there, if you find a place that's dark enough to stand out on deck at night, give it a try if you can find the North Star. They used other stars also. There's a star that we know in the Western world is Arcturus, which is a nice bright star that we can navigate by. It was called Hokulea in Hawaiian, and this was the star of happiness, the star of gladness. Why is that? Because when Arcturus went straight overhead, we knew we were at 20 degrees north latitude, and we knew we were home. All we were going to do is turn downwind and look for the Big Island. Pretty easy to do. We also use land bird observation. There are a lot of seabirds that go out there, and they're at sea. You'll see them out there. They live at sea. There are other birds that go out to sea to live, to fish, but they like living ashore, and they're going to go ashore. Petrels and shearwaters and others are going to go ashore every night. They're going to go to land. So if you're a navigator and you're out there on the open ocean, you haven't seen anything, and one of these birds fly by in the morning, you see him going that way, well, you notice he's coming from some land mass that's over here. In the evening, you keep an eye out for him. You see him going that way. You might be a little off course. You figure the land is over there. Let's turn right a little bit. So we'd watch the birds. Also, clouds, cloud color, flotsam, and seaweed. We saw flotsam, which could be just anything that floats coming on the water, coming from upwind or up current from us. We know that's got to come from land someplace, so that there's land up current from us someplace. Also, seaweed could clearly indicate that a current was passing over some shallow land or a shallow reef someplace, tearing the seaweed off, so we know we're near something shallow. Clouds, we'll talk a lot about clouds over the next couple of days, but clouds were very important in Hawaii. Remember, these islands were volcanic, so they were pretty high. In Oahu, the Kula Range is 3,000, 3,500 feet high. In the Big Island, Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa, 14,000 feet high. The trade winds are going to blow constantly across the North Pacific. They're going to get warm, they're going to be moisture laden, they're going to hit the mountains, and they're going to have to rise, right? So it's warm, moist air rises, what happens? It cools, and as it cools, what happens? It condenses, and it's going to rain. So if you're a navigator and you're out on the ocean, you don't see land, but you see a cloud over here that doesn't move. What does that represent to you? Well, you know there has to be land under that, forcing that air up and that cloud. Even for coral atolls, because they may not be a big cloud, but they'll warm up during the day and cause the air to rise, and they'll form a cloud over that. And the coral atolls, which may not be very high, will have the lagoon on the center of them. The lagoon will be fairly shallow. The lagoon will be green in color because it is fairly shallow. It'll reflect at the bottom of the cloud. The bottom of the cloud will look a little, have kind of a greenish tint, so you know that's a coral atoll over there. What about wave action? Well, I don't think there's anybody on the Queen Victoria today that's not conversational with the swell now. Since we've had about 11-foot swell since we left port out there, and you can actually see it. You can see it on your TV, on the bridge camera when you look, if you look at it very closely, or if you want to get a little closer to it, you can go out on deck 3 and take a close, hard look at the swell as it comes by. It's not the wave, it's the overriding swell that goes thousands of miles and is not really going to be affected by local weather. And that's what the ancient Polynesian navigators had to learn, was what the swell actually was. If that swell moves 1,000 miles or 2,000 miles and then hits an island, it has to go around the island, right? So part of the swell is going to reflect off the island, part of the swell is going to refract around the island. So it'll make the waves kind of, it'll make the waves appear confused a bit. And here we can see this. This is a picture I took on the southwest side of Oahu, which is on the opposite side of the direction of the island from which the swells arrive. Here we see one swell that moves in this direction and another swell that's moving in that direction. So we can see the reflection and the refraction of the swells out there, and if we're an astute Polynesian navigator, we know that that means someplace over here I have to have some land. That's the only thing that would cause that. We also know two other things as a Polynesian navigator, and that is the sun is going to rise in the east every day and it's going to set in the west every day. We know those two things for sure if we don't know anything else. So it's very important for us to be on deck and alert at sunrise and sunset and see which direction the swell is. Because if we can see the direction of the swell, because we know that direction is east, we know which direction the swell is moving, we know which direction we want to be going on if we had a star observation overnight. So we see the relative distance between the swell set and our bow, and we know this is the direction that we want to move in. You can do that too if you go out on deck or use your cabin television and look at. We're going to sail about the same course, 259 degrees, 260 degrees, down to Maui. And I'll bet you if you take a look at the swell today on your television and study it for a bit and see what the distance is from the bow of this ship, or what the relative angle from the bow of this ship that the swell is setting at, when we get to Maui, I'll bet you that the swell is at about the same relative angle. As a matter of fact, I'll even bet you a nickel on that. We also use pilotage. The ancient navigators would look at the small islands as they went by and know that they were going by island XYZ over here. We know we wanted to pass it on the left and go between this one on the right. So we'd use pilotage as we went through the islands. Also, we know that our navigation is not completely accurate, and we're in a sailing vessel, so we may not be able to hit these things like we've got a GPS. So they weren't really worried about that. If they were leaving Island A, which may be way up here in the right, and they're sailing over here to this group of islands and want to hit one over here, they're not going to be too persnickety about exactly which one they hit. They just want to hit one, okay? Because once they arrive at any one island, they'll know exactly where they are, and they can turn and go to the island of their destination. The same thing here, if we're going from Hawaii down to Papeete, down to Tahiti, we would not want to leave Hawaii and aim straight at Tahiti. Why? Because Tahiti is a smaller island than Maui. You don't want to be aiming that narrow, because if you say, okay, this voyage is going to take us 30 days to get down there, along about the 31st day, you're looking around and you still don't see Tahiti, what do? You don't know if you missed it to the left, you don't know if you missed it to the right, you don't know if you've gone too far or not far enough, so where do you turn? That's called being lost. As a navigator, you don't want to be in that state. So what we would do is we would aim at the entire Tuamotu archipelago, which is 400 miles wide. Now come on, we're going to hit something if we aim at an archipelago that's 400 miles wide. And that's the play. We're going to hit one of the islands in the Tuamotus, and we're going to recognize that island and say, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. Okay, Tahiti's over here. Or if we don't recognize the island, hey, our decision tree is even simpler. We pull up on the beach, get off, walk ashore, and ask somebody, where's Tahiti? And they say, well, it's over there. So it's not hard. So you can see the concepts are fairly simple. The implementation takes a lot of practice, but the concepts are there. Well, Opano, in the oral history of the Hawaiian people, proved that it could be done over and over again. He was one of the Tahitian leaders that went to Hawaii, He came after the first Tahitians had started moving up there. He found that the Tahitians had intermarried with the Marquesas people. Well, the Tahitian people had very strong taboos. They had a very set argument about how they wanted the succession of their leaders to go. It had all to do with mana or spirituality or your connection back through your forebears to the gods that had put everybody on the earth. So if you're marrying somebody off here that isn't in this connection, you're reducing your mana. So he said, I'm going to bring a bunch of chiefs up there, and we're going to have chiefs that have a lot better mana. And so he made a number of voyages back and forth, bringing new people into the Hawaiian Islands to, recharge the Tahitian bloodline. But he did it a number of times back and forth. Well, if we're going to say this is the argument, we're going to say we have this canoe, we're going to say we have this navigational skill, we can do this, but we don't have anything in the archaeological record or even the oral history that says we did it, because even the Hawaiians would admit that there are several different oral histories about how they came to be in Hawaii. What can we do about that? Well, one of the things we can do is create a modern archaeological record. In other words, we can say we've got these theories, let's go do them. So we'll build a canoe, we'll form a society. The Polynesian Voyaging Society was formed by some very forward-looking people in 73. They funded and built a canoe, the Hokulea, in 76, and they were ready to go except for one thing. They had the canoe. What was missing? Navigator was missing. They didn't have any navigators. Remember, they had stopped navigating, they'd stopped voyaging in Hawaii 700, 800 years before. So that skill had gone out of the Hawaiian culture. Nobody knew how to do it anymore. But they didn't do it. At the time of Cook arriving in Hawaii, the Hawaiians' horizon literally was the horizon. They didn't go beyond that. They would voyage between islands, but they didn't go beyond the islands. They didn't have anybody that could do it. So they started looking around for somebody that would know something about the ancient Polynesian voyaging and how to do the navigation, and they found this man. They found him in Micronesia on an island right off the island of Yap, and his name is Mau Pinolog. And Mau happened to know a Peace Corps volunteer who happened to know someone in Honolulu, and they made the connection, and they asked him if he would not come to Hawaii and be their navigator, because this guy was out doing it every day out in the Caroline Islands. He was out going to sea without a compass, going to sea. He didn't have a sextant. He didn't bother with charts. He knew where he was going. He knew what the sea was. And they asked him if he would not come to Hawaii and navigate their canoe down to Tahiti. They finally persuaded him to do so, and he had great reluctance in doing that, because in the Micronesian society, you did not give away secrets like this, because other peoples could come in using those secrets and so forth to take over your territory. Well, that was the old thought. Of course, in modern life, that had already happened. They had already lost their way. Mao couldn't pass this knowledge on to his children. They were not the least bit interested in it, so he said, okay, I'll come to Hawaii and I'll guide your canoe. Now, he hadn't been south of the equator, so he spent quite a bit of time in the Bishop Museum's planetarium learning the stars south of the equator, but he felt fairly confident, and they said, okay, let's give it a try. So they did. In 1976, the Hokulea set sail for Tahiti. They had about a dozen or so crew members on board. They had a safety vessel that went with them that had modern navigation techniques and could take them off if they ran into any kind of trouble, and also kept a record of exactly where they were. And you can see that Mao was a pretty savvy fellow, because even though this was a guy who still, in modern time, lived in a Stone Age lifestyle out there about the way he was going about fishing and navigating, he was a pretty savvy fella when it came to the ocean, and he wasn't afraid of the ocean. But you'll notice what he did. If we look at the yellow line, this was the course that Mao set down to Tahiti. When he left Maui, he didn't go straight down there, did he? The reason was he knew there was a wind shadow behind the big island. The big island at Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa, 14,000 feet high, cut off the wind. You get to the lee of Mauna Kea, you can be becalmed out there for a number of days. Instead, he went north until he could weather the eastern point of the big island, turned around, and away he went. And if we look at this line, where is he going? He looks like he's aiming for the Marquesas, doesn't he? Well, he wasn't. He was aiming for Tahiti, but what was he doing? He was going to make sure he was well upwind when he crossed the equator of Tahiti. He wasn't going to be in that ambiguity down here. Well, did I miss it left or right? He knew where he was going to miss it. He was setting a course for the Marquesas. They're down here to be well upwind. crossed the equator, went through the doldrums, drifted around for a while. When they picked up the southeastern trades, he knew he had it made a course correction here. The day before they saw Malaiva, he told the crew, "We'll see land tomorrow." And the crew is looking at him like he's from Mars, because they've seen absolutely no sign of that, but he had. He had been doing this all his life. He said, "We'll see land tomorrow," and they did. They saw Malaiva on June the 1st. They knew exactly where they were. They knew they were only a couple of days out of Tahiti. Word ran before them to Papeete that they had made it. They had sailed down using an old Polynesian voyaging canoe. They'd sailed using the old navigation techniques. Do you think this energized the people of Polynesia? 17,000 people met him at Papeete. That's half the island population. 17,000 people poured out into the harbor. So many canoes and boats came out in the harbor, they were afraid they were going to turn the Hokulea over. It was a huge event. It was a huge event for all Polynesians, not just the Hawaiian people, but it proved that their ancestors had been courageous. Their ancestors had a theory, had applied the theory, and had gone back and forth for hundreds of years successfully and migrated an entire population up to Hawaii. Mao did more than just navigate them down to Tahiti. He came back and taught, several years later, taught another generation of Hawaiians how to be navigators, and then they could go out and navigate on their own. So he navigated not only the canoe down to Tahiti, but he navigated the Hawaiian people back into a connection with their history, back into a connection with their forebears, and during that time, this huge success caused across Hawaii a big explosion of interest and concern with Hawaiian history, and we see that today when we go to Hawaii. You're going to see a lot of hula clubs that hula came back in. You'll see paddling every day. You'll see people out paddling in their canoes, and there'll be canoe racing. You'll see people speaking the Hawaiian language today. Mao was quite a guy, and he had quite an impact on Hawaii. As a matter of fact, that first generation of navigators that he taught to navigate have now taught a second generation of younger people to navigate using the old Polynesian navigational theories, and the Hokulea is planned to sail around the world next year. Talk about courageous voyaging. When Mao died last year, his impact was so great. Of course, he was written up in the Saipan newspaper and Guam newspaper in Micronesia, and the Papeete newspaper and the Honolulu Star Advertiser, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the Economist magazine in London, because of the impact that he had had on the Polynesian society. How courageous were these people? Well, here's a drawing of the boat that they used, 62 feet long. They went 2,000 miles in it. Here's a picture of the boat we're using. 964 feet to go a like distance. Not the same distance, but it could go the same distance. 2,000 miles. This vessel is, 15 times larger? And we can get some kind of idea of the courageous voyaging by the people of Polynesia when they made that connection back with their forebears. We'd like to say mahalo to Herb Kani for his wonderful drawings and his insight into helping to form the Polynesian Voyaging Society, and also the Polynesian Voyaging Society for their photographs that we use today. I'll be on board for the next 2 weeks and be happy to answer any questions from you. My wife and I will be around the ship. If you see us, we'll be happy to talk story with you about Hawaii and trade some adventures with you. And you tell us your favorite place, and then we'll tell you ours. And we look forward to being with you for the next 2 weeks. Thank you.